Welcome back, fellow armchair generals, as we continue. Panzer Corps, well, no, I don't like this start. Welcome back, fellow armchair generals, to... No. Welcome back to Barbarossa, fellow armchair generals. This is Gamer 1745 as we continue Panzer Corps. This is, of course, the Barbarossa mission. Okay, so been a few days since I was last here. Let's see. Okay, you've got to get to an air base. If we were to drop, well, they're going to strike us. So we're going to come to here, get refueled. These guys are going to shoot many as we can of them out of the sky. Now I'm looking for another proper fighter, preferably. Okay, here we go. But if we do anything here, like strafing them, that anti-aircraft gun will get us. So we're going to come down here. Take them down. And take them out and take the victory point. They might have been able to move up that way. That anti-tank gun has been basically useless. Yeah. I know he's down here. I'm not going to get up here in any useful time, but would have liked that up in the north. Okay. Oh, can't make it. Oh, he can make it down here. Bye-bye. That heavy artillery piece is really taking a pounding, and these guys are no longer supported. No. They, of course, need resupply, but also reinforcements could be used. Full. Back. He survived. Okay, well, we want to take that to get the... Well, we don't want to be in range of that, but we want to be down here to be able to... Oh yeah, that was sort of what I was worried about, the possibility there. I'm going to leave you right where you're at, actually. Okay, if either of them attack directly, they should get some response from that, so... Okay, let's end the turn. That hurt. Ouch. Okay, well. Okay, they no longer have artillery support there. Somebody's saying hi, but not right now. That hurt them. Okay, now that did hurt them. We need to see about... Well, they're tough. I know these aren't the engineers, which would have been the better thing to do, but still pretty tough. Oh, there's this guy still here. Wow, I didn't even realize that. Oh, that should have happened first. Man, I totally spaced on him. Okay, now he's gone. Wondering why my units were having such trouble moving forward. Okay. Ouch! 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 Good, they retreated. Fortunately, they retreated. I don't want to lose my elite panzers. Good, counter battery fire. Ouch! 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 Yep, spend it all. For sure. Okay. They've got the range and the gas and the... So they're going to come here and strike at them when they're set up as anti-tank guns as opposed to being set up as... I don't know how useful that's going to be. Okay, good, and they're suppressed, so these guys will take them out. That is what I was looking for. Now here, let's see, we're worried about... Okay, there's an airbase up there, so let's head up this way. So they should be able to make it next turn to the airbase. And from here they should as well. Okay, Wow, that didn't work out very well, did it? So I should have done that. That was going to be an easy, clear victory. Yeah. You occupy that. You come up here. Oh, for outstanding service, the 26th Panzer IV Ds were awarded the Iron Cross First Class. Oh shoot. Oh, okay, you can still move. No, undo that. We're gonna take that was just a pseudo reconnaissance to see if there's anybody actually holding that. Okay. Forget. Okay. There we go. There we go, got that. Now, here, And as I'm thinking about it, probably be a good idea to no, we're going to use you. Okay, there we go. It was a good idea, see? Okay, come on, occupy the airbase. It'll assure us fuel there. I think that's maybe the last unit there. Yeah, I'm not surprised. There we go. Is there anything left? Just go there for fuel. You just get out from the bombardment area. I think that will end this. Here and now. Sorry, just reaching for something, and yeah. Okay. Let's end this. Okay, decisive victory. Just never get blood on your Lugers. Okay. Outstanding success has left us with an interesting opportunity here, General. All of your, I'm using the old Panzer General pronunciation. All of your initial objectives are secured with such speed that Heinz Guderian, architect of the Blitzkrieg, believes it may be possible to use the momentum to bypass huge pockets of Soviet troops and advance directly on Moscow. Should you choose to turn your forces north to Moscow, such a decision may cost you considerable prestige in the eyes of those who view this venture as nothing more than a dangerous gamble doomed to fail by overextending an already taxed invasion. Many officers believe it would be much more prudent to swing south and properly eliminate a massive pocket of Soviet forces built up around Kiev. While this is probably the safest choice, the more time you spend subduing Kiev, the less time before the onset of Russian winter. Which choice? The choice is yours, Herr General. Okay. There is a massive amount of debate around this issue, and in no way am I going to be able to do it real justice in this moment. But this is a very critical issue. Okay, if again, this is my understanding, but if you had not completed the pocket, the Kiev pocket, or whatever you want to call it, not completed that, those forces were not really in a position to significantly counterattack against you. And I say that meaning I don't think they had the fuel. I don't think they had the strategic mobility. Because sure, they may have, the tanks, and they may even have the fuel to drive the tanks considerable different distance. But how much fuel do you have to get the trucks, and how much distance can you go with the wagons to move all the food? There was starvation with some of these surrendered prisoners. because the Germans just get these huge numbers of prisoners, and I don't want to give the numbers right here because I'd be wildly guessing. But get all these prisoners, and then they, start walking, in large columns. You've seen maybe some of the film of that. Well, they didn't also pick up all of their, depots of food, which may or may not have been destroyed. They didn't pick up the wagons that they used to, the cook wagons, and all of that stuff with all of them. They were just now people that were being moved. There was no longer the support element to maintain them. And the Germans hadn't like, oh yeah, hey, we're going to, capture, 500,000 or 100,000 or whatever the, individual area numbers of prisoners. And so we're going to have all that food ready for those guys. They barely had enough food for themselves. So this isn't poor planning even. It's just, unexpected success, and you can't deal with that. So I look at that and I look, okay, well, the Soviets, at least for a reasonable time in the near future, they can continue to supply them food and other things in that area. But that doesn't mean that you can rapidly pick them up and counterattack with these forces. I would say at most, again, this is without, it's been years since I've really sort of really read an article on this or anything like that. And I know scholarship changes as more and more information, especially coming from the, not just Soviet information, but information that the Soviets captured because they get Berlin, massive amounts of archives that get locked away in the Soviet system, and even stuff is misfiled and is still being uncovered, things that the current Russian government does not consider any sort of state secret. They don't care about what any German or Nazi or whatever documents are, unless there's some sort of secret weapons program that they got a hold of. Everything else, the current Russian government is happy to have basically international, at least this is my current understanding, I know it was in the past, international scholars come in and look at it. They might be touchy on certain Soviet issues of, during the war, but I don't even know if there's much of that the current Russian government cares about to keep secret. And, horrors that the Soviets do it, the current Russian government. Yeah, we're not those Soviets. We believe in the Russian Orthodox Church and all this other stuff. So they've distanced themselves. So these archives, but the archives whether it's, video interviews or whatever, and different things, they're still, like, oh, here's this box of stuff. It's labeled, mess reports, but really it's, battle reports or something, just mislabeled, whatever, they're still going through these archives. So there's still scholarship to be done. And it can also be, like I say, German stuff that just gets boxed up at the end of World War II that survives, various things that the Soviets get a hold of. To my understanding, we know the Monuments Men, and at least one of the big, made it in there, and I've seen some film footage of the actual place and a bunch of stills, some of these big treasure tunnels. I think there may be still a few treasure tunnels. Now, the stuff may have been, at least the perishable stuff may have been destroyed because it may have filled up with water or whatever. I still don't think they've uncovered all of the SS hiding places. I may be wrong about that. I'm just guessing, because I know if they had good documentation, they've uncovered it because people followed up on the documentation. But I also think some of this stuff was grabbed up by the Soviets, including attempts to just box up and get huge amounts of files and whatnot, documents hidden away. So, like I'm saying, we don't know everything yet. And so scholarship changes. But I really don't think the pocket that they're talking about here was in any danger of being a counteroffensive at this time. What it was a large number of soldiers and a reasonable amount of equipment that at least at that moment would have seemed useful. We can talk about how useful is a BT-7 tank. At some point, the German higher command orders all of these early captured vehicles to have their turrets removed if the Germans are going to keep using them, because the Germans don't want them to be used as fighting vehicles. The T-34s, yeah, you can keep using those in German marking. You've got the older stuff. No, you got to take the turrets off. Basically, they're used as they call them, munition schleppers, ammo carriers kind of thing. They're sort of armored battlefield supply taxis for armored forces. They don't want, because the armor isn't good, and other things. They don't want to lose soldiers fighting them. Now, I do know some of this stuff later. After that sort of time period, I've seen, at least as I'm understanding it, photos with, well, definitely there's a lot of Finnish photos with winter war capture stuff that's been upgunned and whatnot late in the war, but also Hungarian and Slovak stuff. So some of the stuff is still being used later, and I don't know whether that's just stuff that got into Slovak hands or got into Hungarian hands early on, so not subject to the German orders, or whether that's German has it and is, instead of using it themselves, has later transferred it to the Hungarians. I don't know, of the story of individual tanks and whatnot. But so, these tanks are almost, they're stuff that the Germans don't want. The higher command doesn't want the local infantry battalion commander to go, hey, we've got 2 tanks now. Cool. Let's, let's get Fritz and Hans here to drive in this old clunker of a Soviet tank, just because now we have a tank. They don't want them to do that. So a lot of the forces, a lot of the equipment that the Soviets would have been able to move out, and like we were just looking at here, the beginning of this episode, with the big artillery with the tracked wheels, I'm going to say, well, they're wheels in there, but they have the track around them, to be towed. I mean, they're not powered, but they're to be towed to get through all the Russian mud. Those things aren't going to be moving fast. You're likely not going to retreat with those, because the tractors that are towing them are going to burn lots of fuel. You're going to be slow. You're probably going to try to sabotage that, abandon that to get the men and the quicker moving equipment out. So you're still going to lose a lot. So that's really mostly, we're talking about a large force. Can it escape to fight another day? Not, is it a danger now? That's my understanding. Okay. So, is it important to pocket it and take it out? My friend Django probably would say yes. I'm sort of saying Moscow. Now, Moscow, in sort of the European sense, and I was pushing Russia and also sort of emotionally Britain out from the European sense. Obviously, they sort of are, but in the European sense, you got Napoleon. Hey, well, if you get to march into Vienna and they can't defend Vienna, or if there's the army that's sort of screening or covering is moving to it, and you can defeat that sort of relief army, you've won the war. So long as the war isn't, oh, we're going to, take everything away from you. As long as you can come up to a reasonable peace agreement, okay, you've won the war. So Napoleon thinks that once he gets Moscow, he's going to force the Tsar into some sort of peace agreement, some sort of, territorial stuff. Well, of course, as we know the story, the Tsar says, to hell with it, we're retreating and we're burning all the food. We'll burn Moscow if that's what it needs to be, and they sort of do, instead of, surrendering. And the army starves in there, the French army. So could the Soviets survive the fall of Moscow? Absolutely. But could Stalin have survived? Or would there have been a coup within it? The thing that Stalin is constantly worried about, could there have been a coup? I think absolutely. I don't know the dynamics. I don't know how the dynamics would have changed had Moscow fallen, because all it takes is some corporal to pull out his gun and shoot Stalin, like a guard or somebody like that who sees, who believes that Stalin has made mistake after mistake after mistake, and either that corporal is a believer in the Soviet revolution and Stalin has betrayed it, so he's going to kill Stalin now, and not just because he's done show trials, but that he's well, I mean, that may be part of it because he's weakening the revolution, but that his leadership has failed because Moscow has fallen. Or it could be, hey, my brother, my sister, my parents, or whatever have died in Moscow, and I'm going to get revenge. So all it takes is one person to kill Stalin, and then you're going to have a leadership struggle within it. Or, it could easily be some general to show up, or NKVD officer to show up with 30 or 40 men at the sort of traveling HQ that Stalin has somewhere, whether he's flown out or taken the train out. I don't think he's driving out, but even that would be even worse. Show up at somewhere and not look maybe threatening right away, but then do a firefight with Stalin's bodyguards, and boom, you've got a chaos in the Soviet high command. But that doesn't mean that the Soviet Union falls. That means chaos at the Soviet high command, and maybe at that point better long-term decisions, but maybe much more of retreat, fall back to the Ural line, or pick a defensive line or something like that you very well may do. But also you have, what does it appear to the rest of the world, whether that's Britain, whether that's America? Are you going to send lots and lots and lots of supplies to Russia and pocket in the Far East that has lost Moscow? Or are you just going to sort of send a minimum? Just something to say you've done it. Okay, that's one issue. The other issue is, if Moscow falls, and Germany, obviously if we take Moscow and then there's a winter counteroffensive that pushes us right back out, that's a different thing. But if you get Moscow and can hold it for even 6 months, through the winter, you've now massively cut off the rail lines. So all of the stuff coming into Murmansk, the Allies, if you look at some of the rails, and it's been a while since I've looked at the rail map, there are ways around the greater outside of the greater Moscow area to get supplies in both directions, but it's dramatically cut the levels of supply movement, and the longer the distance you have to go on the rails, the more if a train and the engine and all that takes 2 days to do a trip, or takes 6 days to do a trip, well, if it takes 6 days, that is, now you only have 1/3 of the transport capacity at any one time. The train is carrying just as many supplies per day, but getting it from point A to point B, if it takes that much longer, it's like you've cut the number of trains in 1/3. And that's a meaningful thing. It really is. So if you had taken Moscow and were able to hold Moscow with a reasonable, corridor back to Germany, repairing the railways and getting that kind of thing going, you have dramatically changed the situation in the Soviet Union. I think big enough, especially in the hindsight that we now have, that the Soviets were able to replace all that manpower and replace all that leadership effectively enough to keep in the war. Now they didn't know in 1941 whether if we take out this pocket, we take out that pocket, we take out that pocket. They didn't know whether or not Soviet Russia would be able to generate enough officers of a quality that can stand up to the Germans, and they don't know whether they can keep enough soldiers, or whether they can make enough most Nagant rifles, or whatever. They didn't know whether they could or couldn't, because I don't think the Germans understood as it was happening. I think maybe post it they did come to understand it, but as it was happening, how much of the industry had been moved east. Because if you still believe in the great bulk of the industry, of Soviet industry, was, shall we say, in the west of the Soviet Union, and if you just now captured it, you may very much believe, that they no longer have significant arms production. But everybody who knows Soviet arms or Russian arms knows that some of the primary military arsenals are the Tula arsenals. Those are east of Moscow. Okay, the Tula arsenals. I think east, southeast. I don't know, but it's a few hundred miles or more. Don't know the distance, but it's east of Moscow, and that's one of the major, these small arms, and I'm presuming larger arms, one of the major arms productions in Russia, and that goes way back. And so there's this arms industry, and I don't know how much the Germans understood its capabilities in 41. You know, I don't think the sort of special programs that were being done in the Soviet Union, those Germans ever had access to the arms factory region like that. I don't think they did. Obviously, their access was cut off during the World War One, whatever they may have known about it before, and Tula pretty quickly falls to the Reds during the Civil War. So they're sort of, you know, is that arms factory going well, or is it, you know, been show trial after show trial locally and production way down and lots of sabotage? You know, I'm just, you know, is it producing well? They don't know that, but a lot of the other industry is to the west, and so they may think, well, hey, if we kill all the, you know, we destroy all the guns, they won't have anything left to shoot with, or not be able to produce nearly enough. They don't know that at the time. We know now that they were able to, needed a lot of help. I'm in no way saying the Soviets would have collapsed without primarily American, but also British aid, because the British were aiding them even before America gets into the war. Would have collapsed without the American aid, but I'm firmly of the belief that the Soviets would have been nowhere near as offensively minded in the second half of the war without the Western aid, without primarily American aid. Had that not been coming in, of various types of aid, I don't think they would have been offensively minded. They still might have kept all those German soldiers occupied fighting, you know, on the Moscow front, or whatever you want to call it, and tied up all those German troops just as much. And it might very well, and here's a thing, if we had not done that, maybe it would have been American forces moving into Berlin, and then as that collapses, rushing into Warsaw and saving Poland from a Soviet, and the Soviets sort of just get back to the Polish border, you know, as an end result. You know, if the Soviets are fighting hard, tying up millions of German soldiers, but doing so further east. And that I firmly believe would be, and I don't know where the border is, and again, I don't think they would have collapsed, but I think the American aid was critical to their offensive mindedness in the second half of the war. So I think, as this sort of run down my basic analysis, but again, I'm not doing it justice in a real good historical way, is that Moscow, because it's a transportation hub, because it was a symbol, because you got to remember, there ends up being 3 big symbols, and only 2 of them were apparent before the start of the war. 3 big symbols of Soviet resistance. Leningrad, and that had been the old St. Petersburg, so that was, you know, one of the capitals of Russia. The other more ancient capital being Moscow. So those are 2 big symbols that don't fall to Germany. And then the third is sort of somewhat manufactured by both sides because of the Stalin name, Stalingrad. I mean, no one, as they're invading in 41, doing the Barbarossa, no one is paying attention to this small industrial city, which is all it really was, way off on the Volga. Hope I got the river right, but yeah, the name. Out there. No one's really paying attention to that as any sort of, oh, the defensive line, if we could just get past this line. No, that's not on anybody's radar. But it becomes it because Soviet propaganda, because of German propaganda, it becomes this thing. That's why it's an important thing in Hearts of Iron as one of the key points. But had one of those three things that develop, one of two that is predetermined before the start of the war, falls to the Germans, I think you would see a big morale hit. I think you'd see a big international political hit to the Soviets. So I'm very much for pushing to Moscow at this point, because I don't really think you're either in Syria. You're in no. Well, the Russian counteroffensive, and as Django has really done some. Well, he's read a series of books on Barbarossa that the author's done some really serious research on. It really wasn't this sort of myth that we're finding out, myth that all those T-34s and KV-1s were all on the eastern, far east front of the Japanese that were moved west. No, they were sort of back, maybe a bit to the rear of Tula or wherever, already training up prior to the German invasion, and sort of getting ready to be the sort of new model army, if you will, if you get the reference, of the Soviet Union. And they were only, and again, and this is a little bit of speculation, I think they could have been deployed sooner, but they really weren't ready. And they were using all those rails that we've been talking about, railroads and trains, moving all of the industry east and other things to try to ship them west early on, to stop them at Kiev, or stop them, somewhere, and probably would need to be sent in piecemeal anyways, which would have been a bad thing to do. I think that they were able to launch their broad front counteroffensive in the winter only because they have the Moscow rail hub. I may be wrong about that. I think it would have been a limited offensive against Moscow, and because it would have been a limited area focused on, even with such large numbers by the Soviets, I think the Germans would have been in a slightly better shape, because I think they might have been able to better concentrate using the Soviet, because they immediately capture Soviet rail stock, both cars and the engines, and are able to use the Soviet railways almost immediately. Obviously, the Soviets are doing some sabotage, blowing up some bridges, but they're capturing enough of it to use it to a limited extent. Now, it doesn't interact with the Germans, so you got to find a place to pull up, a European gauge train, unload it, load it into some of the limited amounts of Soviet trains, and then take it to where it needs to be. But if you again look at the rail map, trying to move stuff to everywhere along the front gets more and more complicated. So ammunition and food and all that other stuff, and winter clothing and all the stuff that make Germany unable to defend effectively against the counteroffensive. And I think mostly, the Germans take a lot of casualties. They also lose huge amounts of tanks, artillery, and trucks, just because they don't have antifreeze, or they're snowed in, or whatever, and they've got to retreat. There's no way to save the trucks. There's no way to save the equipment, the ammunition or the rifles or the artillery pieces that those trucks tow, or whatever it is. So Germans lose massive amounts of equipment, massive amounts of armor, just because it can't move. And they also lose massive amounts of people, due to exposure, because they may have set up, I'm going to call them igloos or whatever, snow forts that, are with some timber and with whatever, that are able to keep people with less than ideal clothing alive in winter at night, and keep maybe from having frostbite, and keep them in that kind of situation, in sort of, dug in is maybe a bit extreme, but in sort of, somewhat improvised winter quarters. But you take those same people with that same clothing and you make them march across the snow and retreating, you're going to take significant amount of casualties just from the weather on your retreat, let alone the combat. I think mostly the counteroffensive stops. Again, I don't know if we have good information on this, but stops because it runs out of steam from the Soviet end. Not really successful. There are definitely effective local delaying operations from the Germans. Combat, shooting at, destroying some tanks, shooting up some infantry. Delaying, rear guard actions as they're moving back in places, which of course takes up resources, takes up time, whatever. And so the Soviets, but I think it's really more Soviets running out of food, running out of gas, that keeps them from, that gets them to stop. Now they can, probably could have kept marching if the Germans didn't have any ability to resist, but mostly it's they run out of ability to push on the Germans, and that's because it's a broad front. But if it was a narrow front and you can concentrate what generally, even as we can look at and see in a lot of cases, disparity in numbers is not necessarily a big deficit for the Germans, because the Germans generally have much greater communications with different units, including the other element of communications other than simply talking, but communications of supply and that kind of thing to keep the ammo flowing better. That had it been on a more tight, narrow front, because you can look at the railways as they would sort of have to be used to approach Moscow. I think the Germans could have held. I'm in no way knowing it that they could, but I think they could have. So that counteroffensive, and of course they may have not decided to do a counteroffensive against Moscow, because they might have looked and go, yeah, but we got to be ready to hold out come next spring, because if you do a counteroffensive and you take Moscow, which maybe Stalin would have ordered, you're going to grind up a lot of your forces, and come spring, all those rest of those German forces that weren't engaged, because you can't retake Moscow, I don't think, in the time frame effectively, and then spread out and push the Germans back everywhere. They'd still be in place everywhere else and more ready to push again. And so it would be better to have a reserve to deal with the spring offensive. And I think the Soviets could have readily dealt with the spring offensive at that point, because we see a Soviet, and we see, that going back and forth. So I do think Moscow is more critical. I don't, as you can tell, I don't think if Moscow falls, Soviet Union falls. Far from it. But I think it is a key point. So that's going to justify why we're going to go with this. This may be a mistake, because my forces and conditions and their...
This is it. The Russian capital, Moscow. The capture of the city, and with it the leadership of the Soviet Communist Party, represents our best chance to end our campaign in the east with one swift stroke. Due to your successful bypassing of Kiev, the Soviets have had precious little opportunity to reinforce the defenses of the city. But you should expect fanatical resistance from any enemy forces you do encounter. In addition to Moscow, you will need to capture many other cities and the vital rail network for the Great Bear to fall, and for us to maintain control of this vast country through the winter months. Success can only come from speed. Advance your forces as swiftly and surely as you have until now, Herr General, and the Red Bear will surely fall.
Okay, well, we're going to save the deployment phase, and oh, good, we got a lot of points up there, so we'll be able to get our forces into good shape, I think, for this, for the next episode, which I think is appropriate. But hope you've enjoyed it. If you haven't already, please like the videos. Please subscribe to the channel. Love to see you around more often. And of course, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Moscow or Kiev or anything else. See you next time for more historical gaming.